For this video, I feel the need to do things a little differently. Normally I would go through and I would talk about the story and characters, and I would lead into the animation and sound and so forth, but I feel that for this particular case, doing so would almost be like wasting time. Now, why is that? Well, the characters and the base setting of the story I've already talked about in my review of the 2006 adaptation for Fate Stay Night, and as far as the animation and sounds go, well, I talked about that as well in my review of Fate Zero, because they're pretty much identical. Sure, there are differences, of course, between those shows and this one, but like from a story perspective, beyond those, I'd have to start walking into spoiler territory. And as far as the differences in animation go, I can just solve this by showing you some wonderful fight scenes. And you know, that just kind of sells the show right there. So really, I had to think to myself, who am I making this video for exactly? Because there are two kinds of people that are going to watch this video. People who have watched the show and people who haven't. Now, I know that's usually the case with everything I review because there's not really a third option there. But normally, because of this, I try to combine those elements so that it works for both sides. But in this case, if you haven't seen this show yet, and you haven't watched anything from the Fate franchise before this, what are you doing here? If you've never watched anything from the Fate universe before, this is an absolutely horrible place to start, and if somebody told you that you should, you need to stop taking advice from them. Normally, I'm a tolerant person to other people's opinions, especially when it comes to anime, but in this case, to start here makes zero sense. Now, if someone told you to start with Fate Zero, not this, then I would understand. I wouldn't agree with them, but I would understand. And if somebody asked me where I think that they should start if they had seen absolutely nothing, my honest advice would be to tell them to go and watch the 2006 adaptation from Studio Dean, then watch Fate Zero, then watch this. Now hold on, because I know I just mentioned the 2006 version, and there are probably some Fate fans that are grabbing their torches and pitchforks as I say these words and just want to shout at me, "Blasphema!" Just hear me out. This show, Unlimited Blade Works, is an amazing series. Like, if you haven't watched it yet, when you do, I think that you'll agree that at the very least it is a technical marvel for the industry, considering that it's not running on a film budget. And if you did watch it, like, oh, it is so much more than that. But on its own, while it is a brilliant adaptation of Unlimited Blade Works, as good as I could have hoped for, I don't think that it is as good of an adaptation of Fate Stay Night. I find that this thought process confuses people, specifically those suffering from the Brotherhood problem. Haha, you thought I was done with that, didn't you? Well, the Brotherhood problem in this context is for people who think that because this new adaptation, this UBW exists, the original adaptation by Dean from 2006 is not worth watching at all. And to me, those people cannot be more wrong. In fact, watching this series, this new, better adaptation has given me a whole new respect for that original version. If you go back over a year ago to my review of that 2006 series, my general opinion was that it was flawed, very flawed, and told a story that was this mishmash of various plot lines that on its own was kind of a mess, really. But my thought process about it then was really a result of what I thought the show was trying to be, an adaptation of Fate Stay Night as a whole, which ultimately it failed at. However, I don't look at it like that now, and that's because of UBW. A true adaptation of Fate Stay Night, the visual novel, is impossible, just because of the sheer amount of content provided and the way that it tells its story. Like, you can take large visual novels, like Steins Gate for example, and adapt it almost perfectly, simply because of how it was laid out. Like, Steins Gate had a core story path that only diverged at multiple points, which all directly led to endings. Fate Stay has 3 diverging plot lines, and they are all vastly different from one another. As such, to properly adapt Fate into animated form, you need to do it 3 times, one for each route of the game. So at the moment we have this UBW version, hopefully Ufotable's adaptation of Heaven's Feel whenever it comes out in the future, and we have Dean's adaptation of the Fate route, which just puts a whole new light on everything for me. Looking at just Dean's Fate adaptation on its own, I was disappointed because of all the different things from the visual novel that it didn't include. And it tried so hard to include all of them too. And that's why it's not like a perfect adaptation of the Fate route, because it takes elements from the other 2 routes to kind of flesh it out a bit better. Overall though, it did keep the major plot points that are solely unique to the Fate route. Something which I think the creators and the writers for this UBW adaptation assumed that you have seen or knew of beforehand. The flaws I have with UBW's story is simply not what it contains, because it has so much good in it, but what it leaves out. There are several characters in this series, like Rioter and Sakura, and to some extent Ilya and Berserker, that this adaptation just sort of glosses over to the point where I would be disappointed if this was all that you believed Fate's Stay has to offer. But if you consider that an adaptation of the Fate route exists and Heaven's Feel is on the way, then these flaws are much more livable. However, even then, there are some problems worth noting. Another side effect of visual novel to anime translation is the use of info dumping. In visual novel format, this is not something that you ever really have to worry about. You have tons of time for characters to explain their reasoning or their thought process behind any individual thing because it's just text. Time can stop when you're telling a story in the visual novel format or in just the novel format. Time has no meaning there, but suddenly when you're animating it, time is a factor, and there's a finite amount of it. So what we have is a plethora of magnificent action scenes every few episodes filled in between with dialogue. So much dialogue. Like normally I would just say to please show and not tell, but they tried that and there's simply not enough time. They do their best to give this series as much time as possible though. It is a 25 episode series. And that's not actually correct, because there was episode 0 as well, so there are 26 episodes. And then 3 of those 26 episodes are twice the length of a regular episode. So overall, there is about 29 episodes of content to take in, give or take. The characters, at least some of them, fare much better than I expected, but at the cost of others. If you compare this to the Dean version, Emiya and Rin specifically are massively more developed than they previously were. Before, Rin was a token tsundere sidekick with a knack for magic. Now she is an overly sarcastic but capable mage who truly could take the reins as main character if Emiya ever kicked the bucket due to his stupid morals. Speaking of, his morals were just the things that I've always really hated about him, just how illogical they were. Save everyone at the cost of your own life if need be. Great in theory, but idiotic in practice. UBW doesn't kind of fix my perspective on his morals, but at least it doesn't do anything to make it worse. Fate's version of Emiya would be stupidly brazen, thick-headed, and honestly should have died on multiple occasions, if not for the spoiler plot MacGuffin that exists. UBW's Emiya is much more cautious, still not perfect, especially at first, but he never treats Rin as badly as he used to treat Saber, which is a major plus for him. This time he actually understands that both of his female combat partners are completely capable, and he only does boneheaded things to save them when they themselves get blindsided. And you know, I thought that this was perfectly reasonable. But the downside to all this is the neglect of almost every other character. If you were to compare this to Fate Zero, very little focus is placed on the actual Holy Grail War. Specifically, all the masters that take part in it. Ilya having her major plot revelations casually revealed in Fate Zero has little to no screen time, much less any development. She doesn't truly interact with any of the characters besides standing aloof in the distance waiting for Berserker to brutally murder them all, and then later in a single fight where she's too preoccupied with not dying to talk to anyone. Castor gets a decent arc to herself at the very least, but very little time is actually spent on her backstory and development beyond, yeah, she's a crazy bitch. Lancer is just animation fodder for the most part, his master's only getting a 1 episode and a blink and you'll miss it passing reference respectively. Shinji is the other master besides Emiya and Rin that gets the prerequisite amount of time needed to understand his character, but that's only because he's a mentally broken, egotistical coward, and you don't really need that much time to get that across. Secondary characters are just as worse off though. Taiga only has a few moments early on where her comedic slapstick can shine, but it's far too brief and definitely doesn't make up for the lack of Taiga's corner from the visual novels. Sakura is, well, mostly invisible, even more so than Taiga, I would say, not even showing up for 2/3 of the show. And don't get me started on Kire, who after a wonderful, wonderful time as the main villain of Fate Zero gets, what, a few laughing scenes and then he's cut? Like, what the hell is this? Where's the long villainistic monologue of everything that he has planned and schemed and all that leading up to UBW since Fate Zero? Saving it for Heaven's Feel, I guess. Doesn't stop me from being disappointed about it. Now, while the animation doesn't need any real discussion, because it's not like people refer to this series as unlimited budget works, and you can probably see why. But besides that, the music does deserves some mention. This marks the third composer that has been brought in to tackle music for the Fate franchise. Before we had Kenji Kawai with Studio Dean and their adaptation, then we had Yuki Kajiura and Ufotable with Fate Zero. This time the composer is Hideyuki Fukusawa. He's a little known guy that surprisingly does a very good job, all things considered. Now, I know technically that most of the songs that he has made are just remixes of the original tracks from the visual novel, but he still is able to recapture that tone and make these songs sound new again. I would even go far as to say that I prefer his soundtrack for UBW over Kajiura's soundtrack for Fate Zero. And this is mostly because, like, as I've mentioned before with Kajiura's work, a lot of them sound similar with a few exceptions, and oddly enough, those few exceptions actually made it into UBW, and Kajiura actually got credit for all those too, so it wasn't just Fukusawa. I don't think he got enough credit for his work though, because like, I got the Blu-ray edition that has the OST on its own separate disc, and his name is nowhere on it. Kajiura's is though, right there near the end, which I thought was just kind of depressing, because you know, I would have expected them to have put the name of the guy that made most of this music on the case, especially if they put Kajiura's in there. Now, the dub is a weird thing for me. It's not bad by any means, but for me, I think it got crushed by expectations. Because, you see, when I watched Fate Zero, I really liked the dub for that one. And because of it, I just had high expectations for this one, thinking that I would like it just as much. I did not. It's also this weird mishmash of the dub from the Dean series as well, considering that you have Mila Lee and Tony Oliver reprising their roles, for instance, though most of the cast is new. And by new, I mean new to Fate, like Bryce Papenbrook isn't new. But I guess what bothers me is that when I listen to it, for some of the characters, it doesn't feel like they are the actual voices. Almost like what you're watching is a badly synced dub, but it's not badly synced, it's just off. Weird too, considering the cast is not an experience, but it just didn't work for me. Maybe when I get around to watching the dub for the second half, it'll be better, since my dub assessment is only on what is in this first release, but who knows. This series has a monumental amount of polish to it. And it is one of those shows that I really enjoyed watching, at least as of late. Visually, the series is something that will be a benchmark for years to come, but like Emiya's Imitation Weapons, this is but a faded version of the original story. Thankfully, though, this isn't something that I'm going to be too harsh on, because I understand there's only so much that you can do when translating between visual novel medium to an animated medium. And to Ufotable's credit, they did a much better job than I was actually expecting them to. But that doesn't mean that I can fall in love with the story the same way. Like, if you've never read the original visual novel like I have, you won't have the same issues that I did. But also, if you've never watched the original Dean adaptation, you'll have a completely different set of problems. And that, I think, is the biggest issue I have with the show. The series has an ending, but it didn't really feel like it did, because it has all these plot holes that are left open, so many things that are just left unexplained, almost as if they assume that you already know things that you would have learned from the other arcs. And unless you've read the visual novel, the only way you could learn these things is if you actually watch the Dean adaptation, and hopefully soon will watch the Heaven's Feel adaptation. However, I would never tell someone to not watch this show. Yes, it does have its flaws, but it does build upon what we already know about these characters from other things that we may have seen. Like, really, it is just one big character arc for Rin and Amiya, but at least they got one, which is more than I can say for other versions. And ultimately, I enjoyed myself. A lot. Hopefully you will too. So, with all that in mind, I hereby present Unlimited Blade Works with the recommendation to buy it. It is totally a worthy addition to any Anime Watcher's collection, but I feel that it cannot be fully enjoyed without the context that other entries in the franchise give. Hence why I gave Fate Zero Certified Frosty, and not this. More than likely, when Heaven's Feel is released in all of its glory, I will be able to say that the franchise as a whole would receive my rating of Certified Frosty, but I'm not absolutely comfortable with giving UBW one solely on its merit alone. I'm sure this is a controversial opinion, but it's the one I currently hold. Ask me again when I review Heaven's Feel. At the time of this video, UBW has been licensed by Aniplex of America and is available in DVD and Blu-ray from them, or rather, will be, as the second half of the series should be out a month or so after this video airs. As far as legal streaming goes, the series is available on Daisuki.net, a website that I can confirm works in both Canada and the United States. I just can't confirm where else it services. With any luck, you can watch it in more places than just those two, but as is the way with legal streaming, who knows. For alternate anime recommendations, I'm honestly going to put in the 2016 adaptation. Sure, it is at times a mess, and it is nowhere near as well animated, but if you are really interested in the lore and the story of Fate Stay Night, and you can't get your hands on the original novel for whatever reason, it's worth checking out. To further continue, though, even though we are staying with the Nasuverse, my second recommendation goes to the Kara no Kyokai film series. It's a series that is just as beautifully well animated, even though it is several years older than this, and it contains a story that has the same amount of depth, but unlike UBW, is self-contained. So if you haven't watched it, please, 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 please go and do that thing. And between those two, hopefully you should find something to your liking. And that's it for me. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, follow me on Twitter if you feel so inclined, and hey, if you like what I do here and feel like helping out, please consider going and checking out my Patreon page, and if you feel it within your heart, also consider donating. Very special thanks to Daniel Nye, Grace Anderson, Joshua Garcia, Just a Human, Lulika Hadachi, Nikolai Gray, and Jocelyn Atkins for donating already. You guys are supremely and superbly awesome and amazing, and I thank you oh so very much. And so, until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, stay frosty. What? You didn't think this Revere Week of Awesome was over, did you? Nah.